The Wehrmacht officer sat slumped against the stone wall of the temporary holding area in Normandy, his field grey uniform still caked with dust from the hedgerow fighting. It was June 1944, and Hauptmann Friedrich Weber had just become a prisoner of war. Around him, dozens of German soldiers, exhausted, wounded, some still defiant, watched as their American captors moved with an efficiency that seemed almost casual. Weber had commanded a Panzer IV in the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of the most formidable armored units the Reich had thrown against the Allied invasion. For 3 weeks, his crew had fought a desperate defensive battle across the Norman countryside, coordinating complex tactical movements that required split-second timing and constant communication. Their radios, the Funkgerät systems that had been the envy of every other army in 1940, had been their lifeline. But now, as he watched a young American lieutenant pull a small, rectangular device from his webbing, Weber couldn't help but smirk. The American was speaking into what looked like a child's toy, a handheld radio barely larger than a brick, with a short antenna protruding from its top. The lieutenant spoke casually, almost conversationally, into the device. "Baker 3 to Baker 6. We've got about 40 more prisoners coming up the line. Need another truck at the collection point." "Over." A crackling response came immediately. "Baker 6 copies. Trucks rolling now. Should be there in 5. Out." Weber exchanged glances with his Funker, his radio operator, a young Obergefreiter named Klaus Richter, who had survived the destruction of their tank 3 days earlier. Both men had the same thought. This cannot possibly work in real combat conditions. The German military had spent the better part of a decade perfecting radio communications for armored warfare. It was one of the fundamental pillars of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months. Their tank radios, particularly the Fuji 5 and Fuji 8 systems, were sophisticated, powerful machines capable of transmitting across considerable distances. The Fuji 5, standard in Panzer IV tanks like Weber's, could reach 10 kilometers on voice communication. These were not toys. They were precision instruments built by Telefunken and other leading German electronics firms. The specifications were impressive by any standard. The Fuji 5 operated on frequencies between 27.2 and 33.3 MHz, used amplitude modulation for voice transmission, and could be fine-tuned across 10 preset channels. It consisted of multiple components: the main transceiver unit, the power supply, the control box, and various antennas. The system was designed for clarity and range, engineered with the precision that German industry had become famous for. But they were also heavy. The Fuji 5 weighed approximately 30 kilograms for the complete system, required a substantial power supply from the tank's electrical system, and needed careful tuning by a trained operator. The radios filled considerable space inside the already cramped tank interior. Installation required technical expertise, and maintenance was a constant concern. Weber knew this intimately. He'd lost count of how many times his crew had to halt operations because of radio malfunctions, interference, or the need to replace vacuum tubes damaged by the constant shock and vibration of tank combat. The Fug-8, used in command tanks and higher-level formations, was even more capable, but correspondingly more complex. It operated on lower frequencies, between 20 and 25 MHz, and could achieve ranges of up to 80 kilometers under ideal conditions. But it weighed nearly 40 kilograms and required even more power and maintenance than the Fuji 5. Command tanks needed dedicated radio operators who had received months of specialized training. The American device the lieutenant had just used, what Weber would later learn, was called the SCR-300, nicknamed the walkie-talkie by American soldiers, seemed to mock everything the Germans had built. It appeared impossibly small, almost comically so. The entire unit, including its batteries, weighed just 35 pounds, about 16 kilograms. A single soldier could carry it on his back like a rucksack. How could such a device have the power to transmit tactical communications? How could it possibly be reliable under battlefield conditions? Among the German prisoners, the reaction was mixed. Some, like Weber, were skeptical but curious. Others openly laughed. One Unteroffizier from an infantry regiment pointed at an American sergeant adjusting his walkie-talkie and made a joke in German. "Look, the Americans give their children's radios to their soldiers. No wonder they need so many men. They probably can't hear each other." Several prisoners chuckled, though the laughter had a hollow quality to it. They were, after all, the ones in the prisoner cage. An Oberleutnant from the 352nd Infantry Division, captured near Saint-Lô, shook his head in apparent disbelief. "My entire battalion had exactly 3 radios," he said to no one in particular. 3, and we were expected to coordinate across 5 kilometers of front. These Americans, every Feldwebel has his own radio. It's absurd, wasteful, typical American excess. But Weber wasn't laughing. He was thinking. He had been in Normandy for 3 weeks, and in that time, he had witnessed something that troubled him deeply. The Americans moved with an extraordinary level of coordination at the tactical level. Enemy infantry squads seemed to appear exactly where they were needed. Artillery strikes came with uncanny precision. Tank destroyer teams materialized on his flanks as if they'd been reading his mind. Airstrikes, those terrifying P-47 Thunderbolts, arrived within minutes of being called, sometimes even faster. Weber remembered a specific engagement from just 4 days earlier. His Panzer IV had been positioned in a defensive, hull-down position overlooking a crucial crossroads near the village of Villers-Bocage. His orders were clear: hold the position, prevent American armor from advancing down the main road. It should have been a textbook defensive engagement. His tank had been well positioned, camouflaged among the hedgerows that made Normandy such a nightmare for attackers. His crew was experienced. They'd fought in Russia, survived the Eastern Front's brutal crucible. His 75mm KWK-40L/43 gun could penetrate any American tank at ranges where return fire would be ineffective. He had every advantage, yet within minutes of engaging the first American Sherman tank, everything had gone wrong. The Sherman had been advancing cautiously down the road when Weber's gunner had fired, scoring a clean hit on the Sherman's frontal armor. The American tank had immediately reversed into cover, trailing smoke. A kill, Weber had thought, or at least a mission kill. But then the American response had been like nothing he'd experienced, even in Russia. Within 2 minutes, American artillery had begun falling around his position. Not random harassment fire, but accurate, adjusted fire that walked steadily toward his tank. Simultaneously, infantry had begun flanking movements on both sides, moving with a coordination that suggested they knew exactly where he was and exactly how to approach without exposing themselves to his gun. Most alarming had been the speed of it all. In Russia, when you engaged Soviet tanks, you often had time to reposition after the initial exchange. Soviet coordination was often poor, their response times slow, their tactics predictable. But these Americans had responded as if they'd been expecting his shot, as if they'd already planned their counterattack before he'd even fired. Weber had been forced to withdraw, falling back to a secondary position. His tank had survived, but the engagement had left him unsettled. How had they coordinated so quickly? How had the artillery known where to shoot? How had the infantry known which flanking routes to take? Now, sitting in this prisoner cage, watching these Americans with their portable radios, he was beginning to understand. Richter, the radio operator, leaned close to Weber and whispered in German, "Herr Hauptmann, I've been watching them. Every squad leader has one. Every officer. They talk constantly, to each other, to their tanks, to their artillery, to their aircraft. It's not like our system at all." Weber nodded slowly. In the Wehrmacht, radio communication followed a strict hierarchy. Company commanders had radios, battalion commanders had radios, tank commanders had radios, but infantry squad leaders carried rifles and shouted orders. The idea of putting a radio in the hands of every Unteroffizier was almost unthinkable, not just because of the cost and complexity, but because it represented a fundamentally different philosophy of command. The Germans had built their system around powerful, centralized communications that flowed up and down the chain of command. Tank platoons reported to company commanders, who reported to battalion headquarters, who coordinated with infantry and artillery. It was methodical, organized, and, when it worked, devastatingly effective. This approach had worked brilliantly in Poland, in France, in the early campaigns in Russia, when German forces were advancing, and the initiative belonged to them. German doctrine emphasized Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics, where commanders gave subordinates objectives rather than detailed orders, trusting them to use initiative in achieving those objectives. But even this flexible system relied on communication infrastructure that was fundamentally centralized. A company commander might have freedom in how he achieved his mission, but he still needed to communicate with battalion headquarters, still needed to coordinate with adjacent units, still needed that radio link to higher command. The system had strengths. It prevented the chaos of too many voices on the radio net. It maintained command discipline. It ensured that senior officers retained control of the overall battle. German officers had been trained to think in terms of operational art, of coordinating combined arms at the battalion and regimental level, but it had weaknesses. When a radio failed, an entire unit could be cut off from the larger battle. When command posts were destroyed, as happened with increasing frequency under Allied air attack, entire formations became deaf and blind. The system required infrastructure, maintenance, and time to set up properly, and it assumed that the battle would proceed in a relatively predictable manner, that there would be time for reports to flow up the chain of command and orders to flow back down. As Weber sat in that prisoner cage in Normandy, watching American soldiers casually talking into their handheld radios, coordinating prisoner movements, calling for supplies, requesting medical evacuation, he began to understand something that would become painfully clear to the German military in the months ahead. The Americans had solved a problem the Germans didn't even realize they had. An American captain approached the prisoner enclosure, speaking into his SCR 300, Charlie 6 to battalion. Prisoner processing is complete at this location. We're ready to move them to the rear area. Request MP escort and transportation. Over. The response came within seconds. Battalion copies, Charlie 6. MP platoon is en route, ETA 10 minutes. 3 trucks following. Anything else you need? Over. Negative, battalion, we're good here. Charlie 6 out. The entire exchange had taken perhaps 20 seconds. No runners, no written messages, no waiting for a vehicle to physically travel to headquarters and back. Just immediate, clear, two-way communication. Weber turned to Richter. How far do you think that transmission went? Richter shrugged. Based on the antenna and the power, maybe 3 kilometers, perhaps 5 if conditions are good. It's hard to say. The device is too small for long-range communication. But as they would learn in the coming days and weeks, range wasn't the point. The SCR-300, developed by the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, later known as Motorola, operated on frequencies between 40 and 48 MHz using frequency modulation. It had an effective range of about 3 miles under typical conditions, sometimes more in open terrain, sometimes less in dense vegetation or urban areas. 3 miles didn't sound impressive compared to the Fuji 5's 10-kilometer range or the Fuji 8's 80-kilometer capability. But the Americans didn't need individual radios to reach across vast distances. They had built a layered communications network where information could flow horizontally between units at the same level, not just vertically up and down the chain of command. A squad leader with an SCR-300 could talk directly to his platoon leader. The platoon leader could talk to the company commander. The company commander could talk to battalion. But crucially, the squad leader could also talk to adjacent squad leaders, to supporting tank platoons, to forward observers who could call in artillery or airstrikes. The network was redundant, flexible, and resilient. If one link broke, others remained functional. If a command post was destroyed, subordinate units could continue coordinating with each other. The system didn't rely on any single node or any single powerful radio to function. It was distributed, decentralized, and, in the chaos of modern combat, far more robust than the German approach. The technical specifications of the SCR-300 were revolutionary not because of any single feature, but because of how those features combined to create something genuinely new. The radio used 18 vacuum tubes and was powered by dry cell batteries that provided about 20 hours of operation. The entire unit fit into a canvas case that could be carried as a backpack, with the handset attached by a cord. The operator could move freely while maintaining communication. Most importantly, the SCR-300 was designed for simplicity. It had just a few controls, an on-off switch, a volume control, and a channel selector. Training a soldier to use it effectively took hours, not months. It was rugged enough to withstand the rough handling of infantry combat, and American industrial capacity meant they could be produced in enormous quantities. More than 50,000 units would be manufactured before the war's end. As the sun set over the Norman hedgerows on that June evening in 1944, casting long shadows across the prisoner enclosure, Friedrich Weber watched another American officer pull out his SCR-300 and called for evening rations. The response came within seconds. Trucks appeared within minutes, delivering hot food to the guard detachment and cold rations for the prisoners. The Germans had stopped laughing. They were beginning to understand that they had fundamentally misunderstood what they were seeing. These weren't toy radios. They weren't examples of American wastefulness or technological ignorance. They were something far more dangerous. They were the foundation of an entirely new way of fighting wars, one that the German military was ill-equipped to counter. Weber looked around at his fellow prisoners, tank commanders, infantry officers, artillerymen, combat engineers. All of them had been captured fighting for a military that prided itself on superior training, superior leadership, and superior technology. Yet here they sat, defeated and captured, while their enemies walked around with radios that looked like they'd been bought at a toy store. The irony was bitter. The Germans had invented modern armored warfare. They had pioneered the integration of radios into tactical combat. They had written the doctrine that every other army had studied and copied. And now they were learning that the Americans had taken those concepts and evolved them into something the Germans couldn't match. As darkness fell and the prisoners were loaded onto trucks for transport to rear area POW camps, Weber had one final thought. If the Americans had this kind of advantage in something as basic as tactical communications, what other surprises were waiting? What other aspects of modern warfare had they reimagined and reinvented while the Germans had remained confident in their supposed superiority? The answers to those questions would become horrifyingly clear in the months ahead. To understand why the German prisoners in Normandy were so shocked by American walkie-talkies, we need to step back and examine how both sides approached the problem of battlefield communication and why their solutions were so dramatically different. The story begins not in 1944, but decades earlier, in the aftermath of World War I. The First World War had been a communications nightmare. Armies of millions of men stretched across hundreds of miles of front. Yet commanders often had no idea what was happening, just a few hundred yards from their headquarters. Telephone lines were constantly cut by artillery fire. Runners were killed crossing no man's land. Carrier pigeons were shot down or lost in the smoke and chaos. The result was a war of terrible confusion, where attacks continued long after they should have been called off, where reinforcements arrived too late or not at all, where entire divisions could disappear into the fog of war. Both Germany and the United States emerged from World War I determined to solve this problem, but they approached it from fundamentally different directions. The Germans, under the leadership of officers like Heinz Guderian, saw radio communication as the key to a new form of warfare. Guderian had been a signals officer during World War I, and he understood better than most how the lack of communication had paralyzed offensive operations. His vision for Blitzkrieg was built on the idea that tanks, aircraft, and infantry could work together in rapid, coordinated strikes, but only if they could communicate effectively. In the 1930s, the German military invested heavily in developing sophisticated radio systems for their armored forces. The Fuji-5 became standard equipment in all German tanks by 1939, a remarkable achievement at a time when many armies still relied on flag signals and colored flares for tank-to-tank communication. The Fuji-2 and Fuji-6 systems provided additional capabilities for command vehicles. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Wehrmacht had the most radio-equipped army in the world. The results were spectacular. In Poland, German panzer divisions advanced at speeds that seemed impossible to defenders who couldn't coordinate their responses. French and British forces in 1940 watched in confusion as German units appeared to anticipate their every move, concentrating force at decisive points with uncanny precision. The German military had proven that radio communication was the foundation of modern mobile warfare. But the German approach had an inherent limitation. It was built around the assumption that radios would be installed in vehicles, tanks, trucks, command cars, or at fixed command posts. The idea of giving every infantry squad leader a portable radio simply wasn't part of German thinking. It seemed unnecessary. Infantry moved slowly compared to tanks. They operated in relatively small areas. Their squad leaders could shout orders to their men or use hand signals. Radios were for coordination at higher levels: company, battalion, regiment. This wasn't just a matter of technology. It reflected a deeper assumption about how battles should be fought. German doctrine emphasized the importance of operational art, the skill of maneuvering large formations to achieve strategic objectives. Individual soldiers were expected to be well-trained and disciplined, capable of executing their missions with minimal direct supervision. The role of communication was to allow commanders to orchestrate these movements at the operational level, not to micromanage squad-level tactics. The American approach evolved differently, shaped by different circumstances and different assumptions. The United States military in the interwar period was small, underfunded, and technologically curious. American officers watched German developments with interest, but they also recognized that American forces would face unique challenges: the vast distances of the Pacific Theater, the need to coordinate amphibious assaults, the likelihood of fighting in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy who knew the ground. All of these factors suggested that American forces would need communication systems that were flexible, portable, and easy to use. The development of the walkie-talkie emerged from multiple parallel efforts. In the late 1930s, the Signal Corps began experimenting with portable radio systems. An engineer named Donald L. Hings in Canada developed an early portable radio telephone he called the pack set in 1937. In the United States, Motorola's engineering team, led by Daniel Noble and Henrik Magnusky, began working on compact FM radio systems that could be carried by individual soldiers. The breakthrough came with frequency modulation, FM radio technology. FM offered several crucial advantages over the amplitude modulation used in most existing military radios. It was more resistant to static and interference. It provided clearer voice communication, and it could operate effectively with lower power, which meant smaller, lighter radios with longer battery life. The SCR-300, which entered production in 1942, represented the culmination of these efforts. But equally important was the SCR-536, a smaller handheld radio nicknamed the Handy Talkie. The SCR-536 operated on AM frequencies and had a range of only about a mile, but it weighed just 5 pounds and could fit in a soldier's hand. For the first time in history, individual soldiers could maintain radio contact without being tethered to a vehicle or a backpack unit. The American military didn't just develop these radios, they integrated them into their tactical doctrine from the ground up. Infantry companies were organized around the assumption that squad leaders and platoon leaders would have radio communication. Tank platoons expected to coordinate not just with other tanks, but with supporting infantry who carried radios. Artillery forward observers were equipped with radios that allowed them to adjust fire in real time while moving with advancing infantry. This integration extended to training. American soldiers in 1943 and 1944 received basic radio communication training as part of their standard infantry instruction. Radio procedure, the stylized language of over and out, call signs, brevity codes, became second nature to American NCOs and officers. The radios weren't special equipment reserved for specialists. They were standard tools, like rifles or entrenching tools. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the differences between German and American communication systems had become stark. A typical German infantry company in Normandy had perhaps 2 or 3 radios, one at the company command post, possibly one with a platoon leader if they were fortunate, and perhaps a liaison radio for communication with battalion headquarters. These were typically the Torn Fu portable sets, backpack radios that were more sophisticated than the SCR-300 in some respects, with better range and clarity, but also heavier, more complex, and far less common. German infantry squads communicated the way infantry had communicated for centuries, shouting, hand signals, and runners. A squad leader who spotted an enemy position had to physically run to his platoon leader to report it, or send one of his men. The platoon leader then had to decide whether to act on his own initiative or report to the company commander. If he chose to report, he had to either run to the company command post himself or send a runner. Only then could the company commander coordinate with adjacent units, call for artillery support, or request armor or air support through battalion headquarters. This system worked. German infantry had proven its effectiveness in countless battles from Poland to Russia to North Africa. But it was slow. In the fast-moving, chaotic battles of Normandy, where the tactical situation could change in minutes, speed was everything. A typical American infantry company in Normandy had a radically different communications structure. The company commander had an SCR 300 for communication with battalion and adjacent companies. Each of his 3 rifle platoon leaders had an SCR 300. Each rifle squad leader had an SCR 536 handy-talkie for communication within the platoon. The weapons platoon had multiple radios for coordinating mortar and machine gun fire. Forward observers attached to the company had their own radios for calling artillery. The result was a web of communication that allowed information to flow in multiple directions simultaneously. A squad leader who spotted German positions could immediately report to his platoon leader. The platoon leader could simultaneously inform the company commander and coordinate with adjacent squads. The company commander could call for artillery support while maneuvering his platoons. All of this could happen in seconds, not minutes. The Germans had one other critical disadvantage: they were losing the air war. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe had been largely swept from the skies over Normandy. American and British aircraft operated with near impunity, and they were tightly integrated into the ground communications network. American forward air controllers, working with ground units, could call in airstrikes using their radios. The famous P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force operated a system called cab rank, where flights of aircraft circled over the battlefield, waiting for ground units to call them down on targets. When an American infantry company ran into a German strongpoint, the company commander could have fighter bombers overhead within minutes, sometimes faster. This integration of air and ground operations through radio communication represented a quantum leap in combined arms warfare. The Germans had pioneered the concept of close air support with their Stuka dive bombers in the early war years, but they had never achieved the level of integration that the Americans demonstrated in Normandy. Partly this was because they lacked air superiority, but partly it was because their communication systems weren't designed for this level of real-time coordination at the tactical level. Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Scott, Jr., a fighter pilot who had flown in both the China-Burma-India theater and later in Europe, wrote after the war, "The radio changed everything. Before, we were separate services that sometimes worked together. With these new radios, we became a single weapon system. The infantry were our eyes, and we were their hammer. The Germans never figured out how to stop it. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The SCR 300 operated with about 4 watts of power, compared to the 50 watts or more typical of German vehicle-mounted radios. Its range of 3 miles seemed pathetically short compared to German systems that could reach 10 or 20 times that distance. Its audio quality, while good for FM, wasn't as crystal clear as the best German radios under ideal conditions. But specifications don't win wars. Systems win wars. The American system was designed for redundancy and flexibility. If one radio failed, others could fill the gap. If a command post was destroyed, subordinate units could continue operating independently. The radios were simple enough that any soldier could operate one with minimal training, which meant that casualties didn't cripple communication. Someone else could pick up the radio and keep talking. The German system, by contrast, was vulnerable to disruption. Destroy a command post, and an entire company or battalion could be cut off. Kill the Funker, the specialized radio operator, and the tank or command vehicle lost its ability to communicate. The complexity and weight of German radios meant that they couldn't be widely distributed. They were concentrated at key command nodes, which made those nodes attractive targets. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence officers had learned to recognize German command vehicles by their distinctive antennas. These became priority targets for artillery, airstrikes, and tank destroyers. The loss of command vehicles didn't just deprive German units of communication, it often killed experienced officers and staff who couldn't be easily replaced. There was another factor that the German prisoners couldn't immediately recognize: production capacity. The United States produced more than 50,000 SCR-300 walkie-talkies during the war, along with over 130,000 SCR-536 handy-talkies. German production of portable radios never came close to these numbers. The Tornado 2, perhaps the closest German equivalent to the SCR-300, was produced in numbers measured in thousands, not tens of thousands. This wasn't just about factory capacity. It reflected fundamental differences in design philosophy. American radios were designed for mass production from the start. They used standardized components, simple assembly processes, and robust designs that prioritized reliability over sophistication. They were radios that could be built by the hundreds of thousands and used by soldiers with minimal training. German radios reflected different priorities. They were precision instruments, carefully engineered for optimal performance, built with tight tolerances and sophisticated components. In peacetime, or in the early war years when German industry was running smoothly, this approach produced excellent results. But as the war dragged on, as Allied bombing disrupted German production, as critical materials became scarce, the complexity of German radios became a liability. By 1944, German units in the field were often operating with radios that were wearing out, breaking down, or simply unavailable. Maintenance became increasingly difficult as spare parts disappeared. Trained radio operators became casualties and couldn't be replaced with personnel who had the necessary technical expertise. The sophisticated radio network that had enabled Blitzkrieg in 1940 was fraying, breaking down under the cumulative strain of years of war. The Americans, by contrast, had radios to spare. If an SCR-300 broke down, another one came up with the next supply truck. If batteries ran low, fresh ones were always available. The industrial might of the United States, the same industrial capacity that produced tanks, aircraft, and ships in numbers that dwarfed German production, also produced radios by the tens of thousands. Sitting in their prisoner cages in June and July of 1944, watching American soldiers casually using their walkie-talkies to coordinate everything from hot meals to artillery strikes, German officers were witnessing the fruits of these different approaches. They were seeing what happened when a military system was designed not around the excellence of individual components, but around the integration of those components into a flexible, redundant, mass-producible whole. The walkie-talkie looked like a toy. It performed worse than German radios in terms of raw specifications, but it represented a philosophy of warfare that the Germans had failed to grasp. that in modern combat, the side that could communicate faster, more flexibly, and more reliably at the tactical level would have an overwhelming advantage, regardless of how sophisticated their individual weapon systems might be. The laughter in the prisoner cages died quickly. The German officers weren't stupid. They could see what was happening. They were beginning to understand that they hadn't lost because their tanks were inferior, or because their soldiers weren't brave enough, or because their tactics were flawed. They had lost because the Americans had solved a fundamental problem of modern warfare that the Germans hadn't even recognized as a problem: how to give every unit at every level the ability to see, communicate, and respond in real time to the chaos of combat. That realization was more devastating than the capture itself. The theoretical advantages of American radio communications were impressive on paper, but the real test came in the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the rubble-choked streets of German cities. This is where the walkie-talkie proved its worth, not in laboratory tests or training exercises, but in the brutal, confused reality of close-quarters combat against a determined and experienced enemy. The fighting in Normandy's bocage country was unlike anything the American army had anticipated. The hedgerows, ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that divided the Norman countryside into a maze of small fields, turned every advance into a deadly puzzle. Each field was a potential killing ground, every hedgerow a potential defensive position. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The carefully planned maneuvers of armored warfare broke down into vicious, close-range firefights where survival depended on split-second decisions. It was exactly the kind of fighting where the SCR-300 walkie-talkie proved invaluable. Staff Sergeant Robert Bob Miller of the 29th Infantry Division's 115th Infantry Regiment described the hedgerow fighting in a 1945 interview. You couldn't see more than one hedgerow ahead, sometimes not even that far. The Germans would let the point squad pass, then open up from three sides at once. We'd be pinned down, taking casualties, and you had maybe a minute or two to figure out what to do before they started dropping mortars on you. In this environment, communication wasn't just useful. It was the difference between life and death. A squad leader under fire could immediately call his platoon leader, who could coordinate with adjacent squads to flank the German position. The company commander could monitor the situation in real time and make decisions about where to commit his reserves. Artillery forward observers could begin plotting fire missions while the fight was still developing, not after messengers had run back and forth with situation reports. The operation around St. Lo in July 1944 provided a stark example of how American communication superiority translated into battlefield success. The 29th and 35th Infantry Divisions were tasked with breaking through heavily defended German positions that had held up the American advance for weeks. The Germans had fortified the hedgerows with machine gun nests, concealed anti-tank guns, and carefully registered mortar and artillery positions. They knew the ground intimately and had prepared elaborate defensive plans. On July 11, 1944, the 2nd Battalion, 134th Infantry Regiment, 35th Infantry Division attacked German positions near the village of Le Mesnil-Roulin. The initial assault quickly bogged down. German machine guns, firing from positions in the hedgerows, pinned down the leading rifle companies. Anti-tank guns hidden in stone farmhouses knocked out 2 supporting Sherman tanks in the first 10 minutes. In previous wars, even in the early campaigns of World War II, this would have been the beginning of a confused, bloody stalemate. Companies would have been isolated, unable to coordinate with each other. Artillery support would have been delayed while runners carried messages back to battalion headquarters. Decisions would have been made slowly, based on outdated information. But this was July 1944, and every American platoon leader had an SCR-300. Lieutenant James Cook, commanding the 1st Platoon of Baker Company, was pinned down in a field approximately 200 yards from a German strongpoint. His radio operator, Private First Class Anthony Benedetto, who would later become famous as the singer Tony Bennett, crouched beside him with the SCR-300. Cook grabbed the handset. Baker 1 to Baker 6 were taking heavy fire from a stone building at grid reference 463289. Can't advance. Need smoke and HE on that position. Over. Captain John Morrison, the company commander, responded within seconds. Baker 6 copies. Stand by. Morrison was already coordinating with his forward observer, who was calling in artillery support from the 216th Field Artillery Battalion. The guns were already laid on pre-planned defensive fire missions in the area. All the forward observer had to do was adjust the fire to the specific target. 2 minutes later, white phosphorus shells began falling on the German position, laying down a thick smoke screen. Under cover of the smoke, Cook's platoon advanced, while the 3rd Platoon maneuvered around the German flank. The entire action, from initial contact to resolution, took less than 15 minutes. This same scene played out dozens of times that day, hundreds of times that week, thousands of times across the Normandy front. The American advantage wasn't that their soldiers were braver or their weapons were better. The Germans were veteran troops, fighting on defensible terrain with excellent weapons. The American advantage was that they could coordinate their actions with a speed and precision that the Germans couldn't match. From the German perspective, fighting against this communication network was deeply frustrating. Oberst Colonel Rudolf Freiherr von Gersdorf, who served as Chief of Staff of the 7th Army in Normandy, was interrogated by American intelligence officers after the war. His testimony, preserved in the U.S. Army's historical archives, provides insight into German perceptions. Your infantry seemed to know everything immediately. When our troops attempted to maneuver, your artillery was on them within minutes. When we concentrated for a counterattack, your aircraft appeared as if by magic. We could not understand how you achieved such coordination. Our own communications were constantly disrupted by your artillery fire and air attacks, yet yours seemed to function perfectly regardless of the tactical situation. Von Gersdorf's observation highlights another critical advantage of the distributed American communication network: resilience. Because radios were spread throughout the force rather than concentrated at command posts, the network continued to function even when individual nodes were destroyed. A rifle company that lost its command post still had platoon leaders who could coordinate with each other and with adjacent companies. A battalion that lost radio contact with regiment could still maneuver effectively because its subordinate companies could communicate internally and with supporting arms. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, demonstrated this resilience under the most extreme conditions. When German forces launched their surprise attack through the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, they achieved complete tactical surprise. American units were scattered, many caught in vulnerable positions. Communications were disrupted. Weather prevented air support. It was exactly the kind of chaotic situation where communication breakdowns could lead to catastrophic defeat. Yet despite the initial confusion, American units maintained cohesion largely because of their radio communications. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in Bastogne, maintained contact with headquarters through a combination of SCR-300 radios at the tactical level and more powerful radios at the divisional level. Squad leaders and platoon leaders coordinated defensive positions without needing to physically gather for meetings, a crucial advantage when German artillery and snipers made movement dangerous. Sergeant John Klein of the 101st Airborne's 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment recalled the siege. The radio was our lifeline. We were spread out around the perimeter, sometimes a couple hundred yards between positions, but we could talk to each other. When the Germans probed one sector, we could shift forces to meet them without exposing runners to fire. The lieutenant would call, tell us where to go, and we'd move. Simple as that. The Germans kept trying to infiltrate between our positions, but we always knew where everyone was. The ability to maintain situational awareness, to know where friendly forces were and what they were doing, was perhaps the most underappreciated advantage of the American radio network. In the confusion of combat, friendly fire and coordination failures had been a constant danger throughout military history. Units attacked positions held by their own side. Artillery fell on friendly troops. Advances stalled because units didn't know whether adjacent forces had succeeded or failed. The SCR-300 dramatically reduced these problems. Company commanders could track the progress of all their platoons simultaneously. Battalion commanders knew where their companies were at all times. This real-time situational awareness allowed for more aggressive tactics because commanders could take calculated risks, knowing they could adjust quickly if the situation changed. Tank infantry cooperation. One of the most difficult coordination challenges in combined arms warfare was transformed by portable radios. In the early war years, tanks and infantry had struggled to work together effectively. Tanks couldn't communicate with nearby infantry except by physically opening the hatches and shouting. Infantry couldn't quickly call for tank support when they encountered enemy positions. The result was often tanks advancing without infantry support, exposing them to anti-tank weapons, or infantry pinned down while tanks maneuvered uselessly in the wrong area. By 1944, American doctrine had evolved to solve this problem. Infantry platoon leaders with SCR-300 radios could communicate directly with tank platoon leaders. When infantry encountered a German position, they could immediately direct tank fire onto it. When tanks spotted targets that infantry couldn't see, they could guide infantry to flanking positions. The two arms worked in constant communication, each supporting the other in real time. The introduction of the SCR-536 handy-talkie further improved this coordination. Some American units began attaching infantry soldiers armed with SCR-536 radios directly to tank platoons. These tank infantry phones rode on the back of tanks and could communicate with both the tank commanders and their own infantry squad leaders. When combat began, they dismounted and served as a radio link between the tanks and the infantry, ensuring constant coordination even in the most confused fighting. German tankers found this coordination extremely difficult to counter. Hauptmann Hans von Luck, commanding a battalion of the 21st Panzer Division, described the frustration in his post-war memoir, Panzer Commander. The American tanks were not superior to ours. Indeed, the Sherman was inferior to the Panther and Tiger in armor and firepower. But they never fought alone. Their infantry supported them constantly, and their artillery seemed to know where we were at all times. When we maneuvered to engage their tanks, their infantry would spot us and call artillery. When we engaged their infantry, their tanks would appear on our flanks. It was like fighting a single coordinated entity rather than separate units. The integration of air support into this communication network created perhaps the most devastating combined arms system the world had seen to that point. Forward air controllers, attached to ground units and equipped with radios, could call in fighter-bomber strikes with remarkable speed. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs of the 9th Air Force operated the cab rank system, where flights of aircraft circled at altitude over the battlefield, waiting for calls from ground controllers. When an American infantry company encountered a particularly stubborn German defensive position, the company commander could request air support through his forward air controller. The controller would contact the circling aircraft, describe the target, and mark it with colored smoke shells. Within minutes, fighter bombers would roll in, delivering bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire on the German position. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Perigary, who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, described the process in a training film produced in late 1944. From the time I decide I need air support to the time bombs are falling on the enemy is usually 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes less. The pilots can see our smoke, we can see them, and we talk them onto the target. It's not perfect. Sometimes weather or enemy fire makes it impossible. But when it works, it's devastating. The Germans can't match it. The Germans certainly tried to adapt. They developed their own portable radio systems, including improved versions of the Tornfu series. They trained their troops in radio procedure. They studied captured American radios to understand how they worked. But they could never achieve the same level of integration because they lacked 3 critical elements: sufficient numbers of radios, the industrial capacity to replace losses, and the doctrinal framework that put communication at the center of tactical operations. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the communication advantage had become even more pronounced. German military communications were collapsing under the combined weight of Allied bombing, fuel shortages that made it difficult to power radio equipment, and the general disintegration of German military organization. American forces, by contrast, were at the peak of their effectiveness, with experienced troops and well-established communication procedures. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 showcased American communications capabilities in a complex, multi-phase operation. The 9th Armored Division's surprise capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, succeeded partly because of rapid communication. When reconnaissance elements discovered the bridge still standing, they immediately radioed this information up the chain of command. Within minutes, orders came back to seize and hold the bridge at all costs. The speed of this decision-making, enabled by radio communication, gave the Americans a bridgehead across the Rhine before German forces could respond effectively. The subsequent expansion of the bridgehead demonstrated the full integration of American combined arms coordination. Engineers building pontoon bridges maintained radio contact with infantry companies providing security. Tank columns crossing the bridges coordinated with traffic controllers via radio. Artillery forward observers directed fire to suppress German counterattacks. Forward air controllers called in strikes on German reserves moving toward the bridgehead. The entire operation flowed with a coordination that would have been impossible without the network of SCR-300 radios binding the force together. German prisoners captured during the fighting around Remagen expressed a kind of resignation about American communication superiority. One lieutenant from the 11th Panzer Division, interrogated on March 12, 1945, stated, "We knew you could coordinate better than us. We had known this since Normandy. Your radios, your artillery, your aircraft, they all work together. We have brave soldiers, and good weapons, but we are fighting as individuals, while you fight as a machine. How can individuals defeat a machine? This was the ultimate insight that German military professionals reached. The walkie-talkie wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was the visible symbol of an entire approach to warfare that the Americans had mastered and the Germans had not. The Americans had created a military system where information flowed rapidly in multiple directions, where decisions could be made quickly at every level, where the actions of squads, platoons, companies, battalions, artillery batteries, tank platoons, and air squadrons were synchronized through constant communication. The technical specifications of the SCR-300, its 3-mile range, its FM transmission, its 35-pound weight, were less important than what those specifications enabled: a fundamentally different way of fighting wars. When Friedrich Weber and Klaus Richter, the German tank officer and radio operator we met in Part 1, finally arrived at a permanent prisoner of war camp in France in late June 1944. They had weeks to reflect on what they'd seen. Other German prisoners arrived daily, and the stories were always the same. American coordination, American artillery appearing within minutes of contact, American aircraft seemingly reading German minds, American infantry moving with impossible precision. In one conversation, recorded by an American intelligence officer monitoring German prisoner discussions, Weber reportedly said to a group of fellow officers, "We built the best tank radios in the world. We trained the best radio operators. We wrote the doctrine for mobile warfare. But the Americans understood something we didn't. It doesn't matter how good your radios are if only a few people have them. They gave radios to everyone, even squad leaders. Cheap radios, simple radios, short-range radios, and they won." Another officer responded, "It's not just the radios. It's everything. Their artillery, their aircraft, their logistics, it all works together. The radio is just what makes it possible." Weber nodded. "Yes, the radio is what makes it possible. That is precisely the point." By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the gap in tactical communications had become one of the defining characteristics of the war's final year. American forces moved with a coordination and speed that German forces simply could not match. The walkie-talkie had become as essential to American infantry as the M1 Garand rifle or the steel helmet, a basic tool of the trade that every soldier understood and relied upon. The post-war analysis conducted by military historians and the U.S. Army's operational research teams confirmed what had been obvious to troops on both sides. Communication superiority had provided the Americans with an enormous tactical advantage. A 1946 study by the Historical Division of the War Department concluded the widespread distribution of portable radio communications equipment to small units gave U.S. forces a significant advantage in coordination and response time. German forces, despite often superior individual weapon systems and well-trained personnel, were unable to match the speed and flexibility of American tactical decision-making. The Germans had laughed at the walkie-talkies. They had seen them as toys, as evidence of American technological backwardness or wasteful excess. But those small, simple radios had helped defeat what was arguably the most formidable military machine ever assembled, not through any single dramatic action, but through thousands of small advantages. A squad leader calling for support seconds faster, a platoon leader coordinating a flanking movement without sending a runner, a forward observer adjusting artillery fire in real time, a company commander maintaining situational awareness of his entire unit while under fire. In the end, The story of the walkie-talkie in World War II wasn't really about radios at all. It was about understanding what kind of warfare the future would require. The Germans had prepared to fight a war of operational excellence, where brilliant commanders and sophisticated equipment would win decisive battles. The Americans had prepared to fight a war of systemic integration, where constant communication and rapid coordination would produce cumulative advantages that no amount of individual excellence could overcome. The Germans had built the better individual radio systems, but the Americans had built the better radio network. And in the vast, chaotic, brutal confusion of World War II, the network won. That was the lesson that German prisoners of war learned in the summer of 1944, sitting in their cages, watching American sergeants and lieutenants casually talking into their walkie-talkies, coordinating a war effort that would grind the Third Reich into dust. The laughter had stopped very quickly. The understanding had come more slowly. But by the end, they all understood. They had been defeated not by superior courage or superior weapons, but by superior communication. The walkie-talkie, that simple, portable, mass-produced radio that looked like a toy, had helped win World War II. Not with a bang, but with 10,000 conversations, coordinating 10,000 small actions, that together had made all the difference.